Okay, we're good to go. I've got to go start another session as chair. So thanks, guys.
Hi, all. I am Susan Heraldes, the chair of this session, finally here. And to move things along, since it's 9:31, I'll just say I'm a professor of Spanish literature at University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. A quick reminder, as I think you know at this point, that the meeting is being recorded. We will get started. 20 minutes per session. I'm going to ask the first presenters to go ahead and introduce themselves. And I think everyone's muted. If you're not, please keep muted. And we will do questions at the end of both presentations. All set? Let's go.
Hi, I'm Cindi Koudelka. I am a curriculum specialist for Fieldcrest School District in Central Illinois, and I also adjunct professor for Aurora University. Do you want the other presenter to go now or to introduce themselves, or do you want me just to go ahead and do my shtick?
Go ahead, right, yeah.
Okay, and do I have sharing abilities?
You should have sharing.
It says disabled.
Okay, let's see, where's our...
if you want to just make me a co-host.
I'm actually not the host of this.
You should be the co-host now.
Oh, am I the co-host?
Amy is going to have to choose.
I'm golden now.
Allow for sharing. Great.
Okay, I am all set. Except I'm not on the one that I wanted to share. There we go. All right. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to talk with you about how do we combine social emotional skills and standards with literacy and academic standards at the same time, because it doesn't have to be an either or situation. We can do both. We can do and. But sometimes I think our content teachers or even our ELA teachers are already feeling overwhelmed with all of the things that they need to do. So they feel like, oh, I don't have time to get those social emotional skills in. So we're going to talk about how young adult literature can really be that bridge for us and help us to do that seamlessly. So we know that our students are coming to us with so much baggage. It's really hard. Even a kid who has a lot of privilege is still coming with things that we may not understand. And it's hard for us to stop everything we're doing and be worrying about whatever they're facing. But our YAL can maybe help us to have those conversations that we need to have with them and help build relationships, because we all understand that is the #1 key in really helping support students. So you're all probably familiar with Maslow's, triangle, where we talk about how we have those kind of deficiency needs, the physiological needs, if they're hungry. That's why we have free breakfast programs. I was just in a meeting and we were talking about, the free breakfast and free lunch programs, and having those safety needs met and those belonging and love needs, and then moving up that thing. And it's not that Maslow's, it's not like, oh, once you have this, you can do this. It's not completely linear, because sometimes we go back and forth. And then a more updated version of Maslow's actually even added another layer in there in terms of growth. So being self-actualized and being kind of transcendent. And then we're also probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. Originally, we had terms like knowledge, which was the most basic level of understanding, all the way up through evaluation, which was much more complex. But now, as of course time goes on, the we've even added to that, and really it's not even just about evaluating, but it's really creating. And I think this is really powerful in talking about our adolescents and thinking about not only are you out evaluating this information, but the really higher level is, are you able to create and produce? And we see that with our students as they are knowing those skills, remembering them, and then applying them, being able to be critical and analytical, and then all the way through being able to kind of create, produce, and really be having kind of student agency and personal social agency. So that brings us to, it doesn't have to be Maslow or Bloom, and it doesn't even, and there's a lot of people who talk about Maslow before Bloom. I argue, and others have as well, that it can be Maslow meeting Bloom at the same time. So while you're meeting their basic needs in life and learning, you know, in Maslow's needs, you can also be working on kind of Bloom's learning hierarchy. So the way that we do this is through YAL. And so we think about the kind of the skills. And so one of the first bridges is the idea of self-awareness and narrative craft. One of my favorite units to do with my 8th graders was the memoir unit. It was kind of an early unit in the year. We talked a lot about identity and thinking about their ability to accurately recognize their own emotions, their thoughts, their values, how they influence behavior, gaining some self-confidence, gaining self-efficacy, and then pairing that with some of the analytical actions in understanding narrative books, writing their own narratives, understanding the role of figurative language, and then making strategic use of digital media and visual displays. So some of my favorite books, because of course we can't be at a YA conference without having some great book talks. So King and the Dragonflies is this amazing, beautiful book about 12-year-old Kingston. So Kingston's brother, Khalid, has died, and Kingston is convinced that Khalid has turned into a dragonfly, and he visits him in his dreams. But he can't tell anyone, of course, because that sounds crazy. He can't even tell his best friend Cindi, because just before Khalid died, Khalid had kind of told Kingston that, you know, Cindi, I've heard a rumor that Cindi's gay, and you don't want people to think you're gay either. So, you know, don't be friends with him. Well, then, you know, kind of dealing with all of this, well, then Cindi goes missing. So Kingston ends up finding Cindi in a tent in his backyard, and basically Cindi is trying to escape an abusive father. They go kind of on a little adventure and kind of hide out down by the bayou. And that's where Kingston really have to start thinking about self-awareness and thinking about how coming to his own understanding, his own beliefs, not only about himself, his brother, Cindi, the whole thing. The second book is Counting Descent by Clint Smith. And what's really cool is when we're talking about narrative craft, we need to talk about all the different ways, from prose to poetry to, when I talk about shout, novel and verse. So this particular book is this beautiful poetry collection in which Smith tries to understand his role in the world, his own family history, tradition. He really explores how to balance his identity with his personal history and the social constructions that has characterized Blackness with certain stereotypes that seems to violate his own experiences. And it's this amazing set of poems that helps us to understand the role of socialization in how we think about ourselves and others. And then Shouts. There's no way we could be at a YA conference without talking about Laurie Hall Sanderson. I might have a minor obsession with her work, maybe even with her, because she is just an amazing person. So, you know, I want to say it was like 1999 that she wrote Speak, which was this, you know, important, beautiful fictional story about Melinda, who had been raped at a school party just before her freshman year. And the problem, and then the story is kind of her healing from this sexual assault. And The thing is that Speak was based on Laurie Halse Anderson's own experiences, but at that time, she wasn't ready to tell her story. She told the story kind of filtered through Melinda's experiences. Well, a couple of years ago, then she wrote Shout, which is her story. And this is a novel in verse, and it is powerful, and it's focused on the truth of her story and how her experiences, how that experience shaped her, the journey she had to kind of go on toward healing, and then a call to action for educating people about toxic masculinity, consent, and sexism. Oops, I'm a little crazy. So when you're doing these things, not only can you read and talk about these books, but there are some activities you can do. One of my favorite activities that the students have done are 6-word memoirs. It's based on some Ernest Hemingway's old, For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. And then students can kind of write their own 6-word memoir, kind of telling their story. Or they can do bio poems, which are like poems kind of about who they are, or I am from poems. So you can take that narrative craft and then have them apply that for themselves. So there you have done some work in literacy standards as well as self-awareness. That's going to lead us to our second bridge, which is social awareness, which is the second SEL standard. And there we're talking about the ability to take perspective of and empathize with others. So we kind of go from mirrors to windows, and including those from diverse backgrounds and cultures. And I like to pair that idea with informational text and the informational standards. And so thinking about how can the person cite specific textual evidence, write informative texts, and even thinking about the academic domain-specific vocabulary and integrating things into those pieces. So some books that are really amazing for this. The first book is The Black Friend on Being a Better White Person. And here's what I love about this as an informational craft book is it's really written kind of like an advice book in a way. It weaves a variety of stories, not only from Frederick Joseph, but brings in other authors, artists like Angie Thomas, and who have experienced racism to basically tell and help white people how to do better. So in here he talks about cultural appropriation, positioning, power, the myth of reverse racism, the damage from microaggressions as well as overt racist acts, and of course, white privilege. It is a powerful informational book. But it is so beautifully crafted that we can use it to show the different ways that you can craft information. That information doesn't always have to be crafted in an exposition, textbook kind of style. The second book is actually a memoir. So you could use it in self-awareness, but here's why I wanted to pair it in to the idea of social awareness. And that is because it's a memoir that is instructive in helping the reader understand the issue of poverty. And I think that we often talk about a lot of different topics, but sometimes we don't talk about poverty. And we have so many students, and especially through the pandemic, that are experiencing poverty. So in this, Rex Ogle talks about navigating his first semester as a 6th grader as a poor kid, basically in a wealthy school district, and his mom, her boyfriend, they're out of work. It's a pretty volatile situation. They end up getting evicted. And so they end up in subsidized housing. This is like really close to the school and everybody. So he like hides out at school so nobody can see where he lives because he doesn't want anybody to know. And I think that that's a conversation to talk about how you can gain information from different formats, including fiction. So I love this book so very much. Patron Saints of Nothing by Randy Rebay. It's again using a fiction book, but I learned so much about the Philippine culture, about the drug problem, and about kind of how international policy impacts countries. So in this case, Jay he finds out his cousin June has died in the Philippines, and everybody's like, yep, it happened. And they don't want to talk about it. And so he doesn't understand why. And so he decides he's going to go, and they're like, hey, stay out of this. And he's like, no, I'm just going to go visit family. But what he really wants to do is understand what happens and uncover the truths. But his investigation ends up leading to a deeper understanding of his family, his culture, the role of international policy, as well as his beloved cousin. So then when you're working with books like these, you can do things, take on some roles where you have students do some perspective taking activities. You can have them create some empathy journals. You can have them create media presentations. What did they learn and how can they inform people about the issues in these books that these characters are facing? And then what are different formats and ways that you can inform people about things that aren't always that strict, like I'm doing here, PowerPoint presentation. That third bridge is then going to move the students into that third social emotional standard, which is decision making. So how can they make constructive choices about their personal behavior, the social interactions that they are engaged with, and how those decisions can need to be based on ethical standards, safety concerns, and really the social norms, but also how can they disrupt social norms that are unjust. And that is pretty much why I really like pairing this with the argumentative craft, and how you can evaluate argument and specific claims in texts, either fiction or nonfiction, again, how they can write their own arguments and how they can apply their knowledge of language to kind of understand things like coded language and how they can make effective choices in understanding those pieces. So there are 3 books that I want to share with you. The first one is called Into the Streets, and I just discovered this book, and it's a really amazing book. It is graphic. It has these beautiful visuals that tells the journey of resistance throughout American history, like all the way back to the Tea Party, all the way through George Floyd protests. So it's super expansive, but what I love about it is it explores the artwork, the music, the fashion, you know, and kind of the intersectionality of the culture and these activist movements. And it highlights the role of young people and teens and that they have played. So like I said, it includes everything from like women's suffrage, civil rights movements, occupations by Indigenous people. So I really, you know, LGBTQ demands for equality. So what I really love about it is it's really inclusive of dealing with a lot of issues. Firekeeper's Daughter is another newer book. It is just beautiful. And in this one, 18-year-old Donna, she's never quite fit in her hometown. And I also love it because it's an Indigenous story and features, and I think that we need to make sure that our libraries are inclusive, featuring a variety of people. And she's excited. She's going to go to college. She's going to kind of, you know, start fresh. But then there's a family tragedy, so she basically has to kind of stay at home. And then when she does, she starts falling for this kid named Jamie. And but then she witnesses a murder, and this drags her into this FBI investigation related to the murder and this new drug. So she agrees to go undercover and find the source of this new drug. But it puts her in this position where she really needs to, she sees a lot of injustice, and she really needs to think about her decision-making and options that she faces. And then the last book I'm going to talk about is Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. This book is so cool. And here's what's really amazing about it. It is literally, the book takes place in 30 seconds. So Will I Am, you know, William, not William, sorry, I went crazy. He basically, his brother Sean has been killed, and in his neighborhood, what you do is you get revenge. And so he grabs his brother's gun and he hops onto the elevator because he is going to go find the kid he believes killed his brother, and he is going to take care of this. But as he is going down the elevator, it seems that people are like every floor he stops on, kind of the ghosts of people who have been impacted by gun violence get on, they kind of begin to talk with him. And basically the whole long way down the elevator, as it stops on each floor, he speaks to somebody new that's connected to his brother. And then we have to decide, like, so at the end, he has to make the decision, what's he going to do? And then a great activity
Cindi,
yeah, go ahead.
You know, we're at 1 minute.
Okay, perfect, because I'm wrapping up right now. And then some activities that you can do with this, with decision making and really looking at kind of social awareness and understanding the world is, it's called Denuman. It's this kind of like basically where you take activities and you reconstruct them to like create these new kind of mashups. So we see just these fun advertisements, and you can have kids to get into some critical literacy and really thinking about what are the coded messages behind some advertisings. So that's what I have for you. And I will stop sharing my screen now. And apparently you have to make that announcement that you're going to share or stop sharing a screen. I saw a meme about that, it was great. So thank you very much.
Okay, fantastic. So we're going to hold the questions till the end of the second presentation. And by the way, I can see people are putting things in the chat, which is great. And feel free to start writing questions that you have about Cindy's presentation in the chat if you would like. And about our second presentation, you can write your questions in the chat to make things go faster. Or of course, you can just, orally ask questions when we get there. So I'm going to go ahead and ask our second presenters to go ahead and introduce.
Well, first, Susan, this is Jonathan Bush. I need the ability to share the screen as well. So if you can make me a co-host, or we can make me a co-host, that'd be awesome.
Allison, are you there to do that?
Yep. Yeah, Jonathan, you're good.
Okay.
All right, there we go. Let me share.
All right, and Jonathan, do you want to go ahead and do an introduction?
Sure will. I'll just start us off. So I'm Jonathan, and I'm here, I'm here with Katie and Megan. So Katie, if you want to introduce yourself, and Megan do the same.
All right. I'm Katie Sluiter, and I am an 8th grade English teacher in Wyoming, Michigan, which is near Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I am a doctoral student in the English education program at Western Michigan University.
And Megan?
Hello, my name is Megan, and I am an undergrad student at WMU studying secondary English education.
And I'm Jonathan Bush, and I also work at Western Michigan University, where we've done some really good work this last year with some Holocaust education, and we're looking forward to sharing with you. Today's presentation is really just an introduction. Like all of us, we can talk for hours and hours on this, and we're going to talk really briefly, but really what today is going to be an invitation for you to think about Holocaust literatures and Holocaust education within your language arts classes. We will then share, I'll put in the chat, our PowerPoint and other resources and things too, but really it's just a starting off point. So I'll start us off with that starting off point, and we'll go from there. So how do we get here? We get to these Holocaust education. Sometimes it comes to us, and sometimes we come to it. I got here essentially by just having people who I knew, and I ended up going to the USHMM, the Holocaust Institute for Teacher Educators, and I built sort of a relationship with our local Holocaust Memorial Center, and I taught a course this last semester, and it's become kind of my part. We have also, Katie was in my course, and she made it through with me, and she recently received funding from her school district to fund a Holocaust education literature project, not just for her school, but broader than that. And then we have Megan. Megan's an undergraduate at Western who received a grant from our university to create some Holocaust education and teaching resource, and she'll reach out at the end to perhaps have you continue with some things with her too, and if you're there. So today's talk is really an introduction. So we all come by different means, some by design, more often we find ourselves coming to Holocaust education because we're the 8th grade teacher in school and we've always taught something. And what we find sometimes is that it's really hard to do, and you have to have a lot of context and knowledge. So consider today to be an introduction, an invitation to grow, learn, and contextualize, but also it's one of those things where if you don't have the background, it can be really hard to do, and it can also happen in some really sometimes unproductive ways. And Megan's going to show us some things here about some texts that honestly we all kind of love, but in Holocaust education, we're all like, oh. So we want to understand the kind of things, the metrics, the ways that we look at texts, and when we choose those texts, because there's a lot of popular texts in Holocaust literatures that may not be the ones that those of us in the field are the ones that we recommend the most. So that's how we got here. Here's 3 opening questions I'm going to start off with, and I'm giving you bad and 2 short answers, terrible answers, which is what I do all the time. Just give bad answers and then say find them yourself. Why do we teach the Holocaust? The short, unsatisfying answer is it's a story of humanity and it needs to be taught. I mean, it's one of those things where, yeah, it's there. It's an important thing for us to talk about. It's important. It tells stories beyond the historical stories. Interesting side note is in European Holocaust education occurs almost solely within the social sciences and social studies. In the US, almost 90% of Holocaust education occurs in English language arts classroom, which speaks very differently about how we approach education from a humanist perspective. So we often find ourselves as ELA teachers teaching a historical event through literatures. And that's why there's a lot that needs to be thought about when we do this. So that's why why teach the Holocaust in English language arts context is the language and text provides insight into the story of the Holocaust and the stories of humanity. So those artifacts, be they memoirs or fiction, young adult text, be first person, poetry, art, gives the insight into the stories and the themes and the stories of humanity that come through there. So again, one more unsatisfying answer there. And the third is, why teach Holocaust literatures? It's because one is there are vast stories. Holocaust has brought thousands of memoirs, wonderful, powerful memoirs from children, from adults, afterwards, from all different perspectives, and powerful literatures and powerful poetries and powerful texts all the way through. And they deserve an audience, and they deserve us to talk about them, and they fit in so many ways, the things that we value in our own work. I'm going to stay as kind of our slide person today as Megan and Katie continue, and I'll get myself muted here. So Megan and Katie, as you go, if I'm not following along the slides, just kind of give me a something like that, and I'll keep us moving. Okay. All right. But it's way more complex than those answers. And here are where better answers are. And we'll put these in the chat. There are vast resources. One of the issues we have with Holocaust education is there are so many resources that it sometimes it's so much great stuff. It's hard to find. These are ones that we use regularly, from the USHMM to Echoes and Reflections, which is a national organization, to Facing History, which also has significant resources in social justice teaching, Holocaust Educators Network for the Olga Lengyel Institute, the USC Shoah Foundation, Yad Vashem, which is the International Holocaust Memorial, and then many more. You will find that there's a really good Holocaust Memorial Museum in your area, no matter where you are in the US or Canada. So that's where I'll stop. And let me do this so I can just get myself, get my mute going.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So, as Dr. Bush has said, there are so many resources out there. It can be a little overwhelming as educators to try and find good literature and good curriculum to implement into our classrooms. So this section is like, what makes a good or bad Holocaust literature book? So when we're looking at Holocaust literature, one thing to start off with that is really, really important is that we need to choose books and stories that are retold or created by survivors rather than perpetrators of the event. So it's an experience for survivors to explain their authentic experience, the tragedies that they had to go through, and it makes it more believable in a sense that students can actually empathize and feel what people during the Holocaust were feeling. And if we continue to choose books that are led by like perpetrators or people who are like an outsider, it's not really giving that choice of authenticity to the horrible event of the Holocaust. Something else that we need to consider as educators is how age appropriate the texts are while still maintaining the historical accuracy. So there is tons of books out there that, have kind of similar topics in terms of like, the concentration camps, how they get there, just kind of like traditional historical events. But there are things that we need to consider as educators, like our audience and what types of topics are going to be accessible to our students without being overwhelming. So other than that, we also talk about using correct and precise terminology. We need to make sure that we are using texts that are using proper terms, because it could lead to misconceptions or fallacies if we use inaccurate terminology. And if we pass that along to students, you can see the downhill spiral, okay? And then the last thing is that you need to choose texts that avoid generalizations and stereotypes. Obviously, we don't want to, influence books that are harmful to people that were persecuted against in the Holocaust. And so we just need to make sure that we are choosing texts that are encouraging and relevant to their stories. And then just a quick little plug, I am going to be doing more research on like literature and how to implement that into a classroom, along with creating like teaching guides and advice from other Holocaust educators. So if you want more information about that, let me know. Thank you. So I told you some things about good Holocaust literature. Now I'm going to talk about some things that are bad. So as many of you have probably read the book, seen the movie, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. It is a very common piece of literature that is taught in schools. And John Boyne, he really made a huge impact because this is one of the first books about Holocaust education that was implemented. But there's some problematic things in there. So one of the first things is that this book is from the perspective of a perpetrator. It is from the perspective of a character named Bruno, who is the child of a Nazi commandant. And that's really problematic because, one, like I said, it's not showing the authentic reactions and life that is going on inside the concentration camp. And also the character that is in the concentration camp named Shmuel doesn't show up until the 10th chapter. And that's not great. So then the second aspect is talking about the character's vulnerability. Bruno, throughout the whole story, does not really understand what's going on, why there are people behind a giant fence, why people are forced to stay here. He even asks his sister, like, who are Jews? And this would not be accurate because as the son of a Nazi commandant and this age range, historically, they would have been a part of Hitler's, my goodness, what is it called? The Young German Boys group. So, yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. So we see that, his vulnerability just really limits the experience. And then along with, not the characters not showing proper elements of themselves, they are also dealing with historical inaccuracies. So for example, like I mentioned, the character Shmuel is about 9 years old in this concentration camp. And unfortunately, the harsh reality is that most children would have been killed off before even entering the camp. And he claims in the 10th chapter that there are lots of boys their age. So that's one aspect of how it is inaccurate. And, you know, it talks about all these other things that could be lead to generalizations and stereotypes, and is very harmful for our students to actually learn. And the final thing, this is just like a little tidbit that I learned that kind of threw me off, was that in the beginning of the book, it says that this story is a fable, which we all know that a fable, you know, usually has, you know, characters that are trying to teach a lesson. But when we're talking about such a heavy topic like the Holocaust, it should be taken and evaluated as a historical book, not a fable. It kind of like devaluizes the experience of the Holocaust. So yeah, as we can see, there's a lot of bad things about this book that we need to keep in mind. And one of the final thoughts of this whole thing was that this information from the book is absorbed by the students, and it impacts their idea of Holocaust education until they learn the correct information. So there was a study done by Michael Gray in 2013 where they asked a bunch of students about the like basic Holocaust information, and many students were saying inaccurate statements because they learned it from the book or the movie. Like some people said that the Jews chose to go to the camps because it was advertised as a holiday, and that's not true. So we just need to keep in mind as educators that we need to choose text that promote the authentic voices of those who were in the Holocaust. And we also need to make sure these are some things that we don't do. By choosing these good books, we're stopping the spread of misinformation. There's that link. And then one quick I was just gonna say a quick resource you can use is from the Holocaust Memorial Center, and it's a guide talking about like a checklist for choosing a book.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap up our session with how I am going to be using Holocaust Studies in my 8th grade English language arts class. One of the things that I did in Dr. Bush's class was imagine a unit, and in order to do that, I did a lot of what Megan talked about with books, because first I needed to pick a text. And so here on this screen, I show that I chose to go with Yellow Star by Jennifer Roy. And there were quite a few reasons for that. One, under course context there, you'll see that is my year in 8th grade ELA. We have a focus of bearing witness. And so the idea of bringing Holocaust studies into my classroom was very natural, because the idea of bearing witness and never forget go hand in hand with the rest of our focus. But then I also considered vertical planning as well. Our 7th graders they choose a chapter from Hidden Like Anne Frank after learning who Anne Frank is in their 7th grade ELA class. And they research the survivors and do an informational presentation. And I used my own 8th graders this year to help me a little bit with planning this and thinking about this. And so they helped me with what they knew, and they told me about what they'd learned in 7th grade, and I conferred with the 7th grade ELA teachers. I also I used to teach at the high school level as well, so I conferred with our 10th grade team to make sure that, yes, they still teach genocide in World War II in US history in 10th grade. And then they also still teach night by Elie Wiesel in their 10th grade ELA class. So I wanted to take what they knew about survivors being hidden in 7th grade and what they were the trauma of the death camps that they were going to be reading about in 10th grade, and create sort of a bridge. So things that my students told me were important were it should be a true story. So any of the fiction that I read, I immediately discarded because I knew they wanted something that was true, not just accurate, but true. And then we had also read Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds that year, and they loved novels in verse. So Yellow Star stuck out to me because it was a novel in verse. It also stuck out to me because Yellow Star is the story of author Jennifer Roy's aunt, who was a survivor of the Lodz ghetto in Poland, one of only 12 children who survived because they were hidden away. So that brought in a connection from 7th grade to this one, but it also brought in, when I surveyed my students about what a ghetto was, they had contemporary definitions, but none of them had ever heard about a ghetto during the Holocaust. So that seemed to be an area of learning that I felt that they need. Jonathan, you can switch there you go. So one of the big things that I learned in Dr. Bush's class from all of the guest speakers that he had come in from various Holocaust study areas was that we really need to dedicate time to creating context. And this is one of the things that really separates good teaching of the Holocaust to maybe more irresponsible teaching of the Holocaust, because students really need to have, as Megan said, the terminology. They need to know what things are, and they need to have the scope. And so I asked my 8th graders some basic questions, and these were some of their real answers. So who was Hitler? An angry white man who wanted to kill Jews. Not inaccurate, but not the full picture. Nazis were Hitler's boys. I had no student out of 103 who could tell me what anti-Semitism was. And so these are some things that need to be taught if we're going to be looking at the Holocaust. And all of them wanted to know why and how. And I think those are important to look at too, because it wasn't just overnight. As some of them think, Hitler came up and he just decided to kill people, and that's not how it worked. All right, next slide. All right, so this is what my unit would look like, and I am going to be quick with this so that we have time for questions and answers. But the before, during, and after reading kind of divided. I picked 3 main things because, like I said, I haven't done this yet. I'm planning for the future. One thing that I learned from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum resources was that it's important for students to take a pre-unit assessment about what do they know and what kinds of things do we need to focus on. Yes, my 8th graders this year helped me out with that a little bit, but I'm going to want to do that again with the actual students that I'll do the unit with. And then to create a definition of Holocaust as a class, and to have visual timelines. So students can see when things happened during World War II. I have students who don't know that the bombing of Japan and the bombing of Pearl Harbor were part of the same war that the Holocaust happened in. So these are important things to draw connections to. During, we would create a timeline of the novel, add to our vocabulary, and so on and so forth. And then at the end, this quarter is our argumentative unit. So Jonathan, you can change it. And for our argumentative unit, we would have students creating responses to why do we learn about the Holocaust? And then these are just a few of the ways that they might be able to do that. So I think there you go.
Okay, that's great. Perfect.
So just a couple, right? So hey, there's a couple things, hey, if you're a middle school teacher thinking about adding text, Katie's there for you. She's our expert. I'm here. If there are any teacher educators around us who want to talk about teacher ed and Holocaust education and English ed, I'm here. And Megan is working, and she's reaching out to people to get people to think about her research project too. So we're gonna put those there. I'll put this whole set of slides in our in the chat, and I'll also put the links to all the different URLs for things, and also the link to that rubric Megan shared about how to select Holocaust literatures. And so in here, our next slide, just one final slide, we have our context here too in that as well. So I'll stop sharing, and I'll make sure I get these in the chats, and then we'll just have our conversation with Cindi and everybody else.
Okay, we've got just under 5 minutes left for questions. And I'm not really seeing questions per se in the chat. So I think maybe we can just go to everybody, general discussion questions, unless anyone wants to write something in the chat, because I haven't seen questions. I've seen a lot of good comments. So questions. Oh, okay, now we have one. I'm curious about the other bad Holocaust books you may have discovered.
So I have found that unfortunately I've been focusing more on using better Holocaust sources. I know that one of like a really big resource that I've been using in terms of finding those texts is, like I said, the Holocaust Memorial Center of Farmington Hills. And then of course the US Holocaust Museum has some really great links, and they have some resources specifically for educators that they can use to find those texts and sample lesson plans, which is always fun.
So let me say sometimes there aren't all just bad texts, but there are texts used badly. The Diary of Anne Frank, which is an important text, is often used really badly because it's not contextualized. And the Franks family experience was not really typical. They were in a very, very different situation. Everything occurs in a very different situation. And so when our students lack the context, like Katie talks about, and we don't have the context or the history ourselves, it's really easy to teach Anne Frank decontextualized as a story of a young girl dealing with her growing adolescence, sexuality, and that's not why Anne Frank is taught, but oftentimes we teach it because that book is handed to us and it's canonical. So it's not so much just about bad text. Actually, I think I can teach A Boy in the Striped Pajama and teach it as a bad text and teach it really well so our students can break that down rhetorically. So it's not so much there, but it's about knowing how to use those texts in a way that's effective for what we want to do.
Is it okay if I use my mic for the question instead of the chat? I teach at an alternative education school, so reading full books is really challenging because we do have a school year in 9 weeks because it's credit retrieval. But I really want to give students the opportunity to obviously learn this information. Would there be any short stories or any those types of texts that I could implement in my class?
Yes,
There really are. Go ahead, Katie. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say there are tons of resources Jonathan shared in the chat, but there are so many links to testimonies, to diary entries that you do not have to do full novels. There's so many short things available, poetry, and mixed media things as well, because they have survivor interviews, both audio and video, and they are just amazing. Recollections, that was a great, I don't have it right on hand, but that was a great resource too.
Okay, thank you.
I noticed really quick, since we're just coming up on time, a couple things. If people need to go off because we only have a minute or so left, you can, or stay on. But there is a question for Cindi here. What types of perspective taking activities have you used with your social awareness bridge? Cindi, you're muted.
Sorry. Sometimes I really like readers' theater activities because I think when people act and use drama, that's a great way to help students kind of get into the skin of somebody else, but also in a way that's not appropriating, because that's very dangerous to do. So that would probably be my number one suggestion.
There's also a question for you, Cindi, about short stories.
There are a lot of great anthologies. There's oh my gosh, there's Fresh Ink out, which is this I want to say Lamar Giles is the editor on that, that has a variety of short stories. There was something else that I was just thinking of and I can't remember off the top of my head, but there are lots of great YA short stories. Flying Stories, I think that was edited by Ellen O. Out there. So there are, again, multitudes of short stories. So if you kind of look up YA anthologies, you may find a beautiful list of diverse and inclusive texts.
That's great. Okay, we're at time. So if people need a break before the 10:30 session, feel free to go off. If anyone wants to stay on to continue questions and discussions, Amy, where are you? I don't know if you're okay with staying on for another minute or so, or if you need to
I'm
get
right here. Yeah. I'm actually supposed to end the meeting, and
okay.
then I will
Right on
start
time.
it, and
Okay.
then I will. If you give me, yeah, and then I'll start it up again for the next session.
The next session. All right. So anyway, I think you all got contact information in the chat, so you can contact each other to keep things going. So super. All right. Great session, everybody, and we will see you at other sessions. Have a good day.